So first, we're going to have Bruce Delgado. There you are, Bruce. Bruce has been a botanist with the Bureau of Land Management since 1988. In 2002, BLM volunteers inspired and helped Bruce to begin planting and caring for coast live oak and valley oak trees on Fort Ord. Currently, there are approximately 150 oaks and 30 sycamore trees being grown on Fort Ord National Monument to replace dead or mature oaks and sycamores where there is no successful natural reproduction. BLM is about to launch a new initiative to inventory and plant and or protect more valley oaks in the southeastern portion of the National Monument. Bruce also helps lead a small nonprofit, Citizens for Sustainable Marina, which has planted and cared for over 100 oaks within the City of Marina since 2013. He is also the mayor of Marina.
Okay, so now do you see the old slide, the first slide?
Yes.
All right, so on the left is a picture of a livestock exclosure of one tree. And on the right is a beautiful, mature, healthy oak tree. And so when we lose those mature ones and don't have good natural reproduction, then one way to get that back is by setting up livestock exclosures, in this case for cattle, but not only cattle are sometimes the purpose of the exclosure. Patrick really covered well, why oaks are important. And so I'll just mention a few attributes that Patrick didn't mention. The acorn mast of oaks is important for livestock, especially for goats, but also for wildlife like elk and wild boar, turkey, other birds. The temperature moderation that happens with oak woodland or isolated oaks in an oak savanna is important for all animals, including people and the plant community underneath them. They are able to filter air pollution and reduce that. They're able to filter water pollution under the ground. Patrick mentioned carbon sequestration. And also, it's the natural heritage of our land to have these oaks. And if we want future generations, our grandchildren, to enjoy what we have seen in our lifetime, then we need to maintain the natural heritage of the future so that they have access to that rewarding quality of life. The next slide, did you see the slide change to slide number 3?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, it was good.
Just want to make sure that as we get started here, things are working on my end. So lessons learned that, we know for the last couple hundred years, livestock and other animals such as gophers and deer and non-native annual grasses, such as wild oats and ripgut brome, can contribute to the poor oak seedlings survival and poor success of replacement oaks. That is, when you plant an oak to replace one that has died, you still have issues to deal with, and the success of replacement oaks for these existing or dying oaks can be affected by other animals and plants. There's a really nice article, very easy to read, in California Agriculture in the 2005 October-December issue, and the link to that is here. But the photo here kind of tells the whole story. You've got 100 to 250-year-old oak in the center that's dead. It's been decomposing for probably 40 or 50 years to get to this point of having little wood left to note the presence of the former matriarch here. And then you have 3 exclosures nearby. So we're a little late in the game here to replace this oak that's been for several decades. But the point here is that we've had a couple hundred years or more of time without an oak tree growing around the drip line of this former, giant. And so we have at least 3 oak trees in this case. That's usually what we do. We plant 3 oak trees for every oak that we're trying to replace, hoping that one of those 3 will make it into adulthood. And lesson 2 that we learned is that goats, and to a lesser extent sheep, will eat the oaks, their seedlings, their leaves, the goats will strip bark. And on the right side of this photo are 2 trees, one of which is unprotected from goats. And the goats have completely girdled it, removing the bark in a 360-degree circle around the oak. So that oak will die. It's possible that below the girdling, it might resprout, but oftentimes the whole tree dies when it's girdled. They also love to eat the acorns, as do a lot of wildlife on Fort Ord National Monument. And how we have dealt with grazing animals on Fort Ord with both sheep and goats. They normally need fence if you expect an oak to survive that's a young one. And we assume, that we don't have cattle on Fort Ord, but they're heavier animals. So even more what I say about goats and sheep is needed for cattle because of their rubbing against our exclosures, their browsing of the young oaks and trampling. So we either herd the livestock away from sensitive oak areas where we don't want the oaks to be decimated, or we fence the oaks. And if we want an oak that's less than 10 years old to survive, whether it's a volunteer, it got going on its own, or we planted it, we GPS their location to map them, and then we fence them, and then we take care of them until they're beyond the point they could be damaged by livestock. And research shows that even with cattle, you need about 6 years before an oak is going to be able to survive livestock grazing. This year, 2021, we started to replace our original livestock exclosures with larger sized ones, because as the oak in the middle of the exclosure grows out toward the exclosure, the goats now have access to it. And if they stand up on the exclosure, they can start to top eat it, top browse it, so they can clip off the meristems. Even the central stem can be severely damaged, which is not what we want. So larger size enclosures are good probably to do in the first place, and we'll get to that a little bit later in the talk here. Our time commitment's pretty minimal per tree, but year round we do need to check on the trees to ensure that the exclosure is solid, that there's a need for water or no need for water, and to respond appropriately, and to replace trees that die. Not everything lives, and even though we plant 3 to 1, we still try to replace the ones that die until we've got one that's fully mature. It takes about 5 hours per tree from start to finish to survey for the acorns, to find the acorn, that is finding the acorns and then collecting them when they're ripe, and then to grow them into seedlings and plant them in the field and then fence them. It takes about an hour per tree per year to check, water, and maintain. And it's something not to forget and to make sure we consider when you go into a new area or plant trees. The gopher baskets are a necessity. They wrap around the rootstock of the tree when it goes in the ground, and the roots can penetrate through the mesh of the gopher baskets, but the gophers can't get inside the gopher baskets, so they can't eat the root zone that you put in the ground. So that's a deal saver to have those gopher baskets above the ground. Many use tree tubes to protect the trees above ground from grazing animals. There's pros and cons to these tree tubes. We'll talk about a little bit later, but it's a maybe. And then there's watering tubes. If you're limited, you have a very short supply of water, you can put a 3 to 4 foot tube into the ground, a perforated PVC segment that's about 4 inches in diameter. You can pull off the cap, put your hose into the tube and get the water directly into the root zone. But if you're not limited for water, they do have a downside to needing to be replaced on occasion because they get filled by burrowing mammals moving dirt around underground. And so your watering tubes last a few years, but then you got to pull them out and clean them. And so there's a downside to those. They're in the sketchy category, and we don't use those on Fort Ord any longer. But if we were limited in water, we sure would. Weed mats, we've used them, and they do good to reduce the competition of thistles and annual grasses that might reduce the health of your young seedlings. But then they too get bleached and torn by just weather and animals. Then you need to replace them. So I'm a little skeptical on weed mats, but they do have their upside. I'm going to take a sort of a virtual tour through 3 of our restoration areas on Fort Ord. The first we call the Pacific Gas and Electric Oak and Sycamore Restoration Site because it was funded initially. Startup funds were provided by PG&E because they removed about 7 trees that they and we did not want to remove, but had to be removed for the safety of the gas line. It's basically right on the edge of the Highway 68, which is a state scenic highway between Monterey and the city of Salinas. So here we are just north of the Highway 68, and these drone photos were taken by a great drone operator named Keith McCoy a couple days ago, and I want to thank Keith for doing this. So you see these light colored circles, and inside those circles, they are pockmarked by littler circles, which are the plants themselves, but that's just it from a bird's eye view of that site. And then when you bring your drone down a little bit, you can take an oblique view, get a better sense of what we're talking about. The black rooftops are nothing more than shade cloth. And these are sycamores and oak trees. The sycamores are a little bit more susceptible to desiccation and leaf burn. And so at this place, which it gets very warm in the summer, we've had better success, less mortality when we've used the shade cloth. And when the trees get big enough to start pushing up against the roof, we take the roof down. And by then they have a little better root system as well, so they don't leaf burn or desiccate as readily. That's just what it kind of looks like in the 20-foot level. All right, and then we go to a different area, a second of 3 areas. We call it the Guidotti Road area. It's a deep valley next to a road, and you can see the different colors. I'm colorblind, but the bluish color is alive, and the yellow green up near the top, there's a couple of dots there. Those are dead trees that need to be replaced. And if you were to walk down into the valley, it would look like this. There's on the right, there's a tree tube around the oak tree, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but I'll just note here that it's a very spindly tree that comes out of these oak tubes. They're not as healthy as trees that grow without the oak tree, without the tubes. So there are some downsides to that. But this is an area that's a little further from the road than some of our other areas, and you're going to have roads, you're going to have sites that are far from roads or close to roads. And the options for all of them include not watering at all, just putting a fence around the tree and hoping that enough rain falls to sustain it through its lifetime. There's nothing wrong with that. You'll just probably have higher mortality and you'll need to do more replacement. Or you can water with a truck that has a tank in the back and a pump attached to the tank. And the pump you run an electrical cord up to the battery with a couple of alligator clips for the positive and negative posts, and you're able to, power your pump. You leave the car running, the truck running, because it'll drain your battery, using that pump without the engine running. That gets your water out of the pump with some pressure, at least about 10 gallons per minute. And if you have gravity feed, that helps a lot. But it's a little bit stronger than just gravity feed alone. But if you had gravity feed, because you have a hill situation where your truck is at the top and your plants are at the bottom, that's great. You might not need the pump. Oftentimes you got to go up a hill, and we'll see that on our next site. So you can also water with jugs, and they're more portable, but they're heavy to carry around. And we'll talk more next in just a second or two about this. All right. So 2 pictures here. On the right, there's a picture of a volunteer doing some maintenance, and behind the volunteer up the hill is a very large coast live oak tree. Well, there are no babies, there are no teenage oak trees, there's no reproduction behind this volunteer. There's only a couple of large, beautiful, mature coast live oak trees. So to get to that size, we're talking 60 to 80 years, something of that nature, maybe more. And so it's a healthy tree there in the background. But, when it gets to be 150, 200 years, you're going to want something to replace it. And it's going to take an equal number of years, right, to get as large as that one is. So here in the 2000s, we have a 6-year-old tree, but you gotta think the long term. When you don't have good regeneration of your healthy mature trees. And back to the watering, you've got a truck with some hoses and you've got some jugs. And if you've got to water a half mile or a quarter mile stretch of canyon, you don't want to line out those hoses and pull them back up and move the truck and line out those hoses and then pull up those hoses and move the truck. That's a lot of effort. And it's also a lot of effort to carry the jugs around. So you do the most efficient thing you do. You move the truck as little as possible and you carry the jugs as little as possible, and you try to find that sweet spot. A nuance here that's shown on the right where the volunteer is that because of burrowing mammals, she has to maintain the basins. So there's an uphill and a downhill slant here. And if you dig the basin deepest on the uphill side of the tree, that's where the water is going to pool up when you water it, and it'll percolate into the root zone. If instead the low spot in your basin is below the tree, that's where the water that you give it is going to pool up, and it'll percolate and run downhill away from your tree. So just little nuances like that. But human nature is sometimes to dig the hole deeper on the downhill side and not take the soil from the top. But you take the soil from the top and use it as fill on the bottom. So you end up with a downhill slope going uphill, a downhill gradient going uphill, because that's where you want your water to be pooling up when you're watering it with your precious water. You put all the effort to getting it here. You want to put it on the right side of the tree. And that will increase your water efficiency if you keep the basins large enough to hold 5 or 10 gallons and free of burrows and mounds. If you get a burrow and you don't plug it, then the water runs down forever through the burrow and it doesn't water your tree. But there are burrowing animals. There are toads, western toads, salamanders. There's a lot of animals that use these burrows. So you don't want to, without caution, you don't want to block off all these burrows. So there's a little bit of nuance in maintaining these basins so that they get the water they need, and you're not killing animals that you're there to try to conserve at the same time as you're trying to conserve your tree. Greatest challenges, watering it enough to keep the plants from dying their first 3 years. And the solution to that is you do the best you can. Everybody's limited to some degree. You plant 3 trees for every tree you need to survive, and you're prepared to replant as needed. That's just reality. Second challenge is building fence that's strong enough and large enough to protect the oaks from leaning, browsing, pushing livestock. More important for cattle, of course. We mentioned that earlier. Solution is to build it large enough the first time, so you don't have to redo it, and check it annually. And you add T-posts. You know, if it's too long a fence stretch between posts and the animals are starting to cave your fence in, then you just add the T-posts that you need. Squirrels are the third largest challenge by doing their burrowing near the base of the trees, which take the water away if you don't do something about those burrows. And then they climb up in the trees and they eat the bark, kind of like goats would. So they strip the bark, and that could injure or kill the trees. So there again, like above, you plant 3 trees for everyone you want to survive, and you get ready for those squirrels to take their share, and then you replant as necessary.
And we're at the 3-minute mark.
Oh, great. So the last site is something called Lion Kill Hill, where a sheep was up in a tree, and there's only one way a dead sheep is going to get up into a tree. And so here we have mostly coastline, but also some valley oaks. And we're starting to plant some valley oaks west of their normal range. As climate change warms our area, we think it might be prudent to start planting some valley oaks a little bit west of their, maybe a quarter mile, half mile west of their natural range, in case climate change makes it more conducive to their needs west of where they have been in the past. A little drone shot of Lion Kill Hill, so you can see some valleys and hills. And on the right side of the center, you might see, in my eyes, little brown circled areas. Those are areas that have been fenced, and there's several oaks in those fenced browner areas. And then on top of the hill, where the people are standing in the middle of the photo, that's me and Keith. There's some more oaks planted there, and then to the left of the photo, down in the swale, to the left of the top elevation there, and there's another swale with some more oaks, just to show you kind of how the oaks are distributed at that site. all of which are healthy oaks, but they're not going to last forever, and there's no reproduction yet. So zooming in a little bit with the showing 4 of the enclosures, kind of how they look, and tubes or no tubes. The tubes are problematic in some ways, and they're helpful in other ways. I would suggest if you're going to fence an area, you don't need tubes inside the fence. But for cattle, if you're not going to fence the area, then you absolutely have to have a tube. And to have a tube, you've got to have a fence post to hold the tube up. And when you take the tube off, you probably need to remove the fence post, or the wind will whip the tree back and forth against your metal T-post, and the tree will get abraded, or it can break, be severely damaged by the T-post. So the tube does have its downsides, and the size and shape of your exclosure, the number of T-posts, all matter as far as labor, hoofing them up hills, cost. And so you want to find that sweet spot where you have enough and not too many. For our planted oak trees, we use smaller enclosures. For the volunteer oaks, which normally grow in clusters, we have larger areas. So our volunteer oaks get the fencing, and our planted oaks usually get pig panels or livestock panels, 16-foot long panels that are very rigid, like you saw on that first slide I showed in the cattle area. What's an oak worth? If you break it down, it's probably worth about $1,300 for just the wood value, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about all those other values that Patrick mentioned. What does it cost to plant and maintain these? It's a pretty minimal cost. If you're planting the trees, it's a little more expensive. If you're protecting volunteer oak trees, it's a little bit less expensive. But basically, you're talking less than $100 a tree. And what's the value? If you were to add in the ecosystem services that Patrick mentioned, it's hard to find a dollar value, but I couldn't find the reference, but I've seen it upwards around $10,000 or $15,000 per tree. So it's a real bargain monetarily, a lot more than its wood cost value. There's places to get money. Patrick has the Healthy Soils Program applications that are going to be up and coming. There are local nonprofits, which would be good for startup and or maintenance costs of your oak conservation, oak restoration projects. And I just want to say thank you all for sharing this time. And I hope that you are able to get out there and do more good work. And a lot of people have helped out on Fort Ord Oak Restoration Program, and I want to give them a shout out. So I've listed a lot of them there, with special thanks at the bottom to Keith for coming out on his Monday to take some of those drone photos a couple days ago. Thank you very much.